Hello, and welcome to Reawaken the Dream, a course for the writer mom or anyone who has to write in small fragments of time because you can't put together a big block of time to devote to writing. We are on lesson 26, our 21st character trait. Can you believe it? 26 of 35. We're entering the home stretch here. We're developing a very practical tool for anyone who popped in here. We're creating the character profile tool that's going to give us the power of living characters. And we're developing each of our character traits. So if you're here for the first time, lesson 26 might not be your best starting point. Check us out with lesson 1 and go over to KathleenSpracklin.com to sign up for the course. All right, before we go any more time on that, let's do a very quick review of last week's character trait. Last week, we took on the character trait of honesty. Now, honesty is a strange one because at first thought you might think that it's an empathy trait, that it has to do with how we treat other people. But actually not. We're talking here about the balance trait of honesty. And balance traits are all about self-mastery. So what we're dealing with in the balance trait of honesty is the struggle for the inner truth, to acknowledge it, to accept it, to recognize it, but not to let our history be the controlling factor of our future. Because it's a balance trait, there are two lost states, the lost state of chaos and the lost state of rigidity. The lost state of chaos occurs when we can't accept the truth, and the lost state of rigidity occurs when we let ourselves be controlled by the past. So victory then is to know the truth and not be ruled by it. So without further ado, let's take a look at the character trait for this week. Trustworthiness. What? Another one that almost seems like honesty. Yes, in a way, but this one is an empathy trait. It does have to do with our relationships with other people. Since we pretty much have a pretty clear idea just in common use of the term, what trustworthiness means, let's go straight to the scenarios. Robert had driven a hard bargain. He wanted 7%. Just for an introduction? Yes. He was upfront about it. He was transparent about it. But he felt that his client would never have had that contract if Robert had not made that introduction. So he drove a hard bargain and he got his 7%. And he justified it to himself because it was out in the open. However, since that moment, and since that struggle with himself, it had been a very long time since the word transparent had anything to do with anything that went through Robert's hands. Trustworthiness. Brenda was the club secretary. She had wanted the club to take out a club bank account, but the other officers had insisted that no, there just we're dealing with $1 million here. We didn't need all the paperwork and rigmarole of having a bank account. But Brenda didn't like the idea that since they'd just finished the bake sale, the club funds were over $600. She She didn't want to mix them in with her family's money at the bank. That didn't seem right to her. But she sure didn't like keeping that cash at home. She felt it was really the only thing she could do, but she worried. What if someone knew she had all that money in her house? She didn't even have a safe or anything like that. She was very worried. Trustworthiness. Mayor Jeff, he liked the sound of that title. Mayor Jeff. Yeah, yeah. He hadn't spent a penny on campaigning, but he had walked the length and breadth of the small town that he lived in twice a day, all during the campaign season. And the folks rallied behind him. They knew him from his business. Well, he'd sold it and retired, but they still knew who he was. And they knew that he had been an honest businessman, and they elected him mayor. Well, he had an important job to do right away because the town needed a new fire truck. So, as one of his first duties, Mayor Jeff sent off inquiry letters to the big three makers of fire trucks. How much would your fire truck cost? He'd received the response from all three, and now he was sending out another letter to all three. This time he wanted to know, okay, now how much is the fire truck without the new car for the mayor? Trustworthiness. Central High were the perennial champions of basketball in their town. South High, they were a joke. They hardly had 6 players tall enough to even go on the court. Except this year, they had a new coach who had them all believing they could actually win. And goodness gracious, they were going out on the court and winning. Central High folks were getting a little bit nervous about this. They had all of the support, they had all the sponsorship, they had every piece of training equipment you could possibly want, and they packed the stands at all of their games with people who rooted for them. Big, big, big go Central High. Little South High, well, they were packing the stadiums too, because it wasn't just the little corner of the city. They were also drawing from all the farmlands to the west and the south, and they were bringing in big crowds too. So it was really becoming quite a cliffhanger as to who was going to go on to the state level. Well, a couple of the big donors huddled together, and the head of them was beginning to ask, okay, guys, how much are you each willing to put up? What do you think it would take to put the referee on our side? Trustworthiness. The struggle of trustworthiness. Well, we'll begin with the animal model as we usually do. This time it's a bird, a cuckoo bird. The cuckoo bird lays its eggs in another bird's nest, lets the other bird sit on the eggs, feed the baby. Ha, ha, ha. Cuckoo bird. Well, trustworthiness is one of those character traits like loyalty that we studied earlier, where the slightest speck of not being trustworthy is really, really awful for our characters. Our reader will immediately dislike any character that has the slightest hint of trustworthiness. Failure there. For us as people, it is in the small things that trustworthiness is tested. In the temptation to say, oh, this won't really matter. Oh, that doesn't make enough of a difference. Oh, it's okay this time. But we certainly do not want to start down the path of loss in the struggle for trustworthiness, because down that path lies every form of corruption. The victory state is simple: doing what's right even when no one is watching. Trustworthiness. It's very highly related to responsibility too, isn't it? Because responsibility, generally acting in a responsible manner, is what builds a reputation for trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is an awful lot about the interior, most like honesty. Well, let's take a little closer look at the other aspects. It's an empathy trait, and therefore there's only scale. But like loyalty, the slightest hint for our character is a serious loss. It's as though the stakes were high and higher. If we have a likable character and we build him up through our story, and now you're going to tempt him with the slightest temptation to sacrifice trustworthiness, our readers are going to be very upset and very anxious for our character to pass that test. It's a serious breach for our character. Trustworthiness belongs to the empathy group, and because the empathy group is very large, we often talk about subgroups. And in fact, trustworthiness is the lead character trait in its own subgroup, the trustworthiness subgroup, which also contains responsibility, sincerity, and loyalty. I don't suppose any of those will be very surprising that they go together in a cluster. And this subgroup is now complete. And so is our study of the character traits for today. Next up, we're going to complete the review of our character profile tool. In previous weeks, we reviewed the components of the character profile tool: the profile diagram, the memory prompt list, the reference sheet. I hope you're keeping them up. They're really starting to get filled. And then last week we talked about transitions, the story arc, the arc of emotions, and the starting and ending character profile diagrams to tell the emotional side of your story. That leaves us 2 topics left to review: presaging and the aha moment. And we'll cover those today to complete our review. Presaging takes place whenever we paint a picture with an element out of joint. It doesn't do any good if you describe it, you have to show it. The example that we used when we first discussed this was the case where the fellow said, "Oh my, what graceful hands you have," but he was eyeing her gemstone bracelet. Remember that one? That's an example of presaging. You know the guy's a crook. We had another one where the thing was out of joint, where the character said, "No, thank you, I don't eat donuts." But she couldn't take her eye off the tray of donuts. Well, we resolved that one quickly by saying, "My grandmother had a tray like that. I wonder whatever became of it." Well, we could come up with another example that's a little more dramatic. We could have someone coming up to a woman who's eyeing a child in a stroller. And the woman says, "Oh, is that your son?" And the woman says, "No, I have no children." And she can't take her eyes off the boy in the stroller. That would be an example of presaging, because we would immediately want to know, Why? What happened? Did you have a son? Did you lose your son? We would know right away that there's a story there. One of the most famous examples of this is a story in 5 words. It's a presage only, and the rest of the story is left entirely for the reader's imagination. It's a story that goes, baby shoes, $5, never worn. All presaging. When you do the presaging, however, you must know exactly what your message is. You have to know exactly what you mean to convey when you say graceful fingers eyeing the bracelet. You need to know in advance what you want to tell your readers. And the interesting thing about presaging is that if it isn't obvious, if it doesn't collapse immediately, like the gal who said my grandmother had a tray like that, then it hangs. It hangs around as an open, unresolved element that's continually in the back of the mind, nagging the reader, nagging the reader. And that is exactly what we want to do with presaging. We want to place things in the back of the mind of our reader, which is a perfect transition into the aha moment. There are really 2 kinds of aha moment. One where we have a cognitive load that collapses in an aha moment, and the other is where we have dramatic tension in the story that collapses in an aha moment. The most easy to talk about is the concept of cognitive load, because that is applicable across every domain: fiction, nonfiction, presentations of every kind, sales messages. The idea of a cognitive load is where you, as a writer, deliberately build up points that don't quite make up a complete picture, but seem like they ought to. Detective stories are all about cognitive load. All about cognitive load. And then if you want your reader to get the aha moment, the best way to do that is not to plunk in the final clue. The best way to do that is to plunk in a tidbit to the final clue and let your reader glom onto that. Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. I know. Whoa, I got it. Boom, and then you tell them. That is the ultimate cognitive load. You drop in that tidbit instead of the last piece, and you let the reader form the conclusion in their own mind. Way, way powerful. And if the reader didn't form the conclusion, didn't figure out who done it, the retrospective cognitive load is also quite satisfying. And frankly, if the reader isn't capable of doing it, it's the best they're going to be able to get. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more today about the tension, the aha moment that comes out of a collapse of dramatic tension. When we presented it for the first time, we talked about George, a nice fellow who is visited by his sister, who drops off her 2 sons and skedaddles. And we had a whole dramatic story around whether or not George was going to take on the responsibility of taking care of his 2 nephews. Well, that's still in the PDF. If you get the PDF of this lesson, that's exactly what's there. But I thought it might be a little more fun for this video if we do a new example. And I love playing with scenarios where I grab character traits out of the blue, pick them at random, and then construct a scenario to go with them. So here are the character traits that I drew. And I have an Excel spreadsheet with the random function on it that generates my character traits, generates whether it's male or female, the age group, and what position in the character profile diagram the traits are going to come. So I grabbed 3 literally at random. I did not did not play any funny games. This is exactly what the randomization gave me. It gave me a woman between 40 and 50. I gave her a name, Carol, and I said she's 47. It gave me a pinnacle trait of gratitude, a wing trait of constancy, and a rudder trait of docility. So I'm going to invite you to pause the video and see what kind of a scenario you can come up with for a woman between 40 and 50 years old with gratitude pinnacle, constancy wing, and docility rudder. And then I'll come back and I'll share what I came up with. Okay, so we're going to have you pause. Okay, are you back? All right, because you could pause the video, so I didn't have to wait too long there. So now I will share with you what I came up with. Now we remember from when we worked with George, the first thing we have to do, we're given the character profile diagram. So that means what we're missing is the memory prompt list. So I need to supply a memory prompt list for Carol. We're in lesson 26. She's a practice character, and she's our first character of the lesson. So this is that card number, just for a quick review of that. And we know that one of our tasks when we create the memory prompt list is we need to take a plausible scenario for each of the 3 character traits. How did they end up in the positions that they ended up in? So here's what I came up with. For gratitude, up here in the pinnacle position, I decided that Carol does not have gratitude because she credits herself for every good thing in her life. She's never had a mentor in her entire life. She's always had to do things all by herself. And even her teachers, she always read the lesson before the class. And when she got to class, it was like, check, check, yes, yes, yes. And so she just is totally pinnacle for her to thank anyone for anything she had. She knew she worked for it all. It was hers. Well, she was something of a semi-bigwig in the community, especially in the school board, local school board. And she did not particularly like doing any tasks that were at all boring. That's why constancy is a wing position for her. Luckily, she was in an excellent position with the authority that she had. It's all community action. We're not talking paid positions here. But because she was a little bit of a big cheese, and she was pretty good at throwing around her prestige, she managed to delegate to other people anything that was going to take constancy. She didn't need it. It was a wing trait for her. But docility is a strange one, because just prior to the beginning of our story, docility wasn't down here at a wing trait. Just before our story began, docility was up here as a pinnacle trait, or here as another wing trait. What made docility pop into the rudder position? And that is where I began my story. You see, Carol showed up at the board meeting, and there was a stranger there, a woman that she didn't know. The woman had quite a presence about her. She seemed to have a lot of stature and authority. She spoke very, very confidently. And something about this woman's nature caused Carol to step back a little bit and not throw her weight around with this woman, or not get into any kind of a power struggle with her. She hadn't quite figured her out. Maybe Carol has circumspection as an anchor trait. That might cause that kind of behavior. We haven't filled that in, but we might. So something made her not get into a conflict with this woman. In fact, the woman took kind of an immediate liking to Carol, kind of sensing in her a fellow leader. Carol wasn't quite sure how to take being assigned the uh, co-authority figure, but before she bristled at it, she recognized who the woman was. Oh my gosh, thank goodness I didn't try anything stupid. This woman was a mover and shaker in the community. She was one of the most well-respected women in the county, incredibly wealthy, and she had taken a liking to Carol? Oh my goodness. Boom. That threw Carol's docility immediately into the rudder position. But that is a point of tension. And that's our whole point of the story. We're going to build tension. Build tension. We're going to know where the tension is. So one of the tension points right away is that docility did one of those pop transitions that we've talked about in the past. When you do a pop transition, it's unstable. It's unstable. And in fact, it's a point of pressure for Carol. She's so much in awe of this woman that she doesn't want to fail. She wants to learn from the woman. She genuinely wants to have her first mentor in her entire life. And the fact that the woman has taken a liking to her is just raises the tension even more because she feels like she's on the spot to do well. She's under pressure. Okay, so we're the writers of the story. What do you do when you have tension in a story? Do you resolve it right away? Nah, we'd lose our readers. Don't be silly. Where there's instability, push. Up the tension. Push. Push. So how are we going to up the tension? Well, this woman, who's still unnamed, suggests that she and Carol co-chair a major project for the community. Now they're going to be working closely and frequently. Not just a once a month meeting where Carol needs to be on her best behavior till the meeting is over. Oh no, this is a project that they're going to be working on jointly. So now docility is in the rudder position. Carol has a choice to make. Is she going to stay and learn from this woman? Or is she going to bug out from fear? Well, what's at stake? We don't really know. We haven't given our readers any kind of a clue yet what's at stake. Let's do that. Let's close the gap. But let's close that gap by upping the pressure. Remember, we're building pressure. So now all of a sudden Carol realizes that with this woman's recommendation, her son could get into any college of his choice. She really, really needs to come through. Boom, tension goes up some more. So now, how does the story progress? Well, we know that from our starting and ending character profile diagrams, that if we want to have a transition that shows growth, we need to find a way to push docility down into the anchor position, which will let constancy drop down into the rudder position. Now we know that Carol has never come through on constancy in the past. It's just not something she's been able to do. But now here it is in the rudder position, and she's going to have a choice to make, and she's going to have to follow through. So now gratitude with that shift has a chance to have shifted down into the pinnacle, into the wing category. So we now have our story ready to be crafted. We know that we have something major at stake. We know that Carol wants to achieve this. So what are we going to do to put a twist into the story that will resolve the tension? Because that's what's going to give the aha moment from dramatic tension. We pump the tension up as much as we possibly can. And the hint here is gratitude in the wing position. We need to throw something at Carol that's going to cause her to be truly grateful. And when she's suddenly, truly, and genuinely grateful, not just wanting to impress to get this college recommendation, not just wanting to impress because the woman is so grandiose, but genuine, heartfelt gratitude. And when she achieves that, boom, everything works. The aha moment with the release of the tension. So that completes our coverage of the entire review of the character profile tool. Next week, we have an interesting topic. We have something that we have never seen before, although I promised it from the get-go that you would have this class. Next week, the only time in the course, we have 2 character traits at once. These 2 character traits are not often used. They're not often talked about. But when they are talked about, they're easily confused. The strange thing is, when you discuss them side by side, they're very clearly different. But if you try to discuss them individually, it's very easy to get them muddled and confused. So we're going to discuss them together, and they are brilliant. They are, well, no more hints. I'm not going to spoil. But you won't want to miss next week, where the entire lesson is 2 character traits. See you then. Bye-bye.